Welcome, dear watchers of Veil of Epochs, wherever you are right now, on your sofa, in your bed, or perhaps sitting on your very own porcelain throne. You're about to embark on a journey that's going to change the way you view your toilet. Forever. Let's be honest, history stinks. Literally. While most documentaries wax poetic about kings and queens, epic battles, or glittering palaces, this episode is diving straight into something humanity has tried to bury, quite literally, for centuries. We're talking about toilets, not the pristine, scented, automatic flush marvels of modern convenience. No, we're digging deep into the dirty, hilarious, horrifying truth of how people have relieved themselves for the last few thousand years. Spoiler alert, it was often outdoors, rarely sanitary, and occasionally stylish. This isn't just a history of how people pooped, though yes, there will be plenty of that. It's about how waste shaped civilizations, how it reflected class, religion, fear, power, and sometimes, surprisingly, innovation. In this episode, we'll explore the communal bum benches of ancient Rome, the luxurious wiping cloths of royalty, and the truly medieval terror of being pooped on from a window above. You'll meet the groom of the stool, the monks who peed in silence, and the brave men who made a living shoveling night soil under moonlight. Yes, history is often told through gold and glory. But today, we're flushing all that aside, because to truly understand the past, sometimes you have to go where no one wants to go. So, hold your nose, clutch your chamber pot, and let's open the lid on a story that's been stewing beneath history's surface. This is what did toilets look like in the past, and this is Veil of Epochs. Let's face it, history loves to glorify its heroes. The emperors, the generals, the philosophers. Their words echo through marble halls and dusty libraries. But we're not here to talk about Socrates' theories, we're here to talk about what he did after dinner. Because no matter how noble or divine, every human poops. And for thousands of years, humanity has gone to increasingly strange lengths to deal with that very universal need. So join us, dear viewer, as we go back to a time before scented toilet paper and ceramic thrones, back to the ancient world, where public pooping was a group activity, and the cleaning method involved vinegar and a shared sponge. The Roman Empire is often held up as a marvel of engineering, and rightly so. Roads that lasted millennia, aqueducts that carried water across mountains. But among its greatest and most overlooked achievements, the toilet, public latrines, or forica, were everywhere in Roman cities. Large stone benches with rounded holes, built above flowing water channels. And here's the part that makes modern audiences squirm. They were communal. No stalls. No dividers. Just rows of Roman citizens, sitting side by side, knees touching, exchanging gossip, while relieving themselves. It wasn't considered weird. It was civic. Pooping together was a sign of civilization. Just as the bathhouse was a place to socialize, so too was the toilet. You might even encounter a senator and a baker chatting while seated on adjacent holes. Everyone needed to go, and they needed to wipe. Enter the tersorium, the most infamous hygiene tool in the Roman world. Imagine a stick. Now imagine a sea sponge tied to the end. Now imagine sharing that with strangers. After wiping, the sponge would be dipped in a bucket of vinegar or salt water, swirled around, and placed back for public use. Whether people brought their own or used communal sponges is still debated, but Roman graffiti and references suggest the latter was common. A tersorium was found in the ruins of Herculaneum, preserved in volcanic ash. Yes, even Vesuvius couldn't wipe away this part of history. While the public shared sponge and chat systems, the wealthy had private latrines, sometimes inside their villas, decorated with mosaics and marble. These toilets often connected to household drainage systems, showing how even elimination could become a status symbol. And in truly elite circles, slaves might be tasked with wiping their masters. Dignity, it seems, had its price. In Egypt, the harsh desert and rich religious life shaped how people approached waste. Toilets were often simple stools, wooden frames with a hole in the center. Beneath lay a pot filled with sand, which was changed regularly. In some homes, these stools were built into benches or niches, especially in the homes of the elite. But more fascinating is how deeply spiritual hygiene was. Egyptian priests were expected to bathe multiple times daily, shave all body hair, and maintain rigorous bodily purity before entering temples. Cleanliness wasn't just about health, it was about spiritual readiness. The act of purging one's body was seen as part of cosmic balance. The god Thoth, who presided over wisdom and equilibrium, was associated with order, including cleanliness. In fact, tombs of high-ranking individuals often included miniature toilet models or full-size latrine replicas, because just as you needed food, clothes, and tools in the afterlife, you also needed a clean way to go, and heaven helped the poor soul who forgot his sand pot on the way to the do-it. If Rome made toilets social, Greece made them unapologetic. The Greeks built latrines attached to gymnasiums and bathhouses, where the focus was on physical perfection and philosophical exchange. People would exercise nude, then use public toilets without any attempt at modesty. And why not? For the Greeks, shame around bodily functions was considered irrational. Even Plato and Aristotle wrote about bodily needs, though, thankfully, not in graphic detail. Greek toilets often featured stone seats over running water, similar to the Roman style. Waste was carried away through underground channels, some of which survive today. In city centers like Athens, latrines were placed near markets, temples, and gathering spaces. Sanitation was public, functional, part of life. Inscriptions and decorations sometimes adorned latrine walls, including poetry, jokes, and even political satire. Imagine graffiti that rhymed and criticized city officials, scrawled above your head while you squatted. And yes, archaeologists have found traces of what was probably a Greek version of the tersorium. Cleaning cloths soaked in vinegar, possibly shared, possibly individual. The truth is unclear, but the smell was likely unforgettable before Rome, before Greece. Before the pharaohs ruled the Nile, there were the Minoans of Crete, and they had something almost no one else in the world did: a flushing toilet. In the sprawling palace of Knossos, archaeologists uncovered a chamber with a stone toilet seat, connected to a sloped drain, which was in turn connected to a water cistern. When flushed, water would wash the waste away. This was around 1700 BC, nearly 3,700 years ago. Let that sink in. At a time when most people relieved themselves behind bushes or into open trenches. The Minoans had figured out indoor plumbing, and then they vanished. The eruption of Thera, modern-day Santorini, and the decline of Minoan society meant this plumbing miracle was lost to time, only to be reinvented by the Romans 1,500 years later. Toilets weren't just functional, they were cultural. Romans painted scenes of gods in their latrines, some of them watching, others warning. A common theme was the god Sterculius, the Roman deity of manure. Yes, he existed. And yes, he had temples. In Egypt, amulets were sometimes placed near toilets to ward off spirits. Going to the bathroom was seen as a vulnerable act, inviting mischief from the underworld. Greeks would often carry small charms for protection, because apparently, demons loved a good squat ambush. Even in such a bodily function, the ancients couldn't help but see cosmic stakes that it's easy to laugh at. Ancient sanitation, sponge sticks. Public pooping, sand pits. But in truth, these societies were innovative, resourceful, and surprisingly forward-thinking. They understood the importance of waste management in urban environments. They developed plumbing before most of the world had agriculture. And they integrated sanitation into religious, social, and political life. Yes, they reused sponges. Yes, they pooped in groups. But they laid the literal groundwork for everything that came after. And they did it with style. When the Roman Empire fell, the world didn't just lose aqueducts and marble roads. It lost the toilet, and not metaphorically, we mean literally. The bustling public latrines of Rome, the flowing sewer systems, the sponge-on-a-stick sanitation, all of it crumbled into ruin, brick by brick, pipe by pipe, until there was nothing left but holes in the ground and very confused people trying to figure out where to relieve themselves without a civilized blueprint, i.e. the vacuum left behind. By Rome's collapse, Europe didn't simply pause. It reverted. The sophisticated hygiene of antiquity gave way to a period so odoriferous, so gloriously grimy, that later historians would coin it the Dark Ages, and not just because of the literacy rates des cities were sacked, aqueducts fell silent. Sewers clogged and overflowed. Engineers vanished, or were killed in raids. Public institutions crumbled. In some places, even the knowledge that such things had once existed was forgotten altogether. The modern equivalent would be if one day, all indoor plumbing disappeared and the entire population had to go back to using the backyard. And so, the people of early medieval Europe, Franks, Saxons, Visigoths, and every tribe between, had no choice but to return to nature. This meant one thing. Open defecation was back. Behind barns, behind hedges, in forests, and on roadsides. If the Roman public toilet had once been a space of community and architectural finesse, the medieval toilet was a ditch, a trench, or nothing at all that in rural settlements, the most common. Latrine was quite literally a hole in the ground, sometimes surrounded by planks of wood for sitting, sometimes just a pit. People would dig it near their home, and when it filled up, and it always did, they'd cover it with soil and dig another one. Not exactly an elegant system, but it got the job done, until it didn't, especially during rainy seasons. Worse still, many medieval peasants didn't bother digging holes at all. Instead, they relied on the barnyard method. If pigs could go wherever they pleased, why couldn't people? And so, it became common in many regions for waste to be deposited directly into nature, often close to food sources, water wells, or living spaces. Sanitary? Hardly. But when you're focused on surviving another winter, hygiene tends to fall on the priority list, right next to personal space and deodorant. For slightly wealthier households, the chamber pot made a valiant reappearance. These were simple ceramic bowls or bronze pots kept under beds or in corners of the room. You'd relieve yourself into one, then toss it outside, sometimes into a designated trench, but often just out the window or door. And this is where the stench of the Middle Ages starts to become more than just metaphor. In towns and early cities, the problem grew dire. Without Roman infrastructure, waste piled up fast. Alleys became sludge channels. Wells were contaminated. Streets were slick with filth. You could walk out of a chapel after Mass and step directly into human excrement. Naturally. People adapted. Badly. Point one solution was to designate public dumping trenches at the edges of town. These were long, open-air pits where anyone could come and empty their chamber pot, toss refuse, or simply squat. There were no schedules, no oversight, and certainly no dignity. On hot days, The stench was enough to drive the sober to drink. Another solution was to build basic wooden outhouses, though the term house is generous. These were shaky, plank-built shelters often perched over a small pit. No plumbing, no ventilation, just a seat with a hole, and the faint hope that your aim was good. They were breeding grounds for flies, rats, and disease. And in the winter? Absolutely frigid. Imagine burying your bottom in freezing wind while balancing over a slushy hole of your own family's waste. Now imagine doing that every day. But while the peasants suffered in filth, monks had rules. Yes, amid the chaos, monasteries preserved some sense of order, even in their bathroom routines. Monastic life was governed by structure, discipline, and the rule of Saint Benedict, which outlined when and how monks should engage in bodily functions. Toilets in monasteries were usually shared communal latrines, often built as extensions over rivers or streams so that waste could be carried away naturally, an echo of Roman ingenuity. These facilities were called reredorators, attached to the dormitories, with stone or wooden seats arranged over flowing water channels. But there was a catch. Toileting was to be done in silence, no speaking, no eye contact, no jokes. Monks filed into the latrines in hushed processions, robes rustling, heads bowed, not out of shame, but out of reverence. This was still the house of God, after all, and defecation, though necessary, was not to be indulged with chatter or levity. Some orders even dictated prayers to be said before relieving oneself, because apparently, in the medieval mind, the act of passing gas could be a spiritual event. In contrast, the growing barbarian kingdoms, those that had carved out territories, in post-Roman Europe, treated hygiene with indifference or even disdain. The Germanic tribes, the Norse settlers, the Celts, and early Anglo-Saxons all had varying relationships with cleanliness, but none were particularly obsessed with toilets. Most tribal settlements had no fixed latrines. Waste was disposed of in nearby woods, rivers, or anywhere that seemed out of the way. And while some leaders may have had designated privy spots behind their halls, for the common warrior or villager, it was a matter of convenience and geography. In fact, archaeological digs of early medieval settlements often find very few latrine remains, not because people didn't relieve themselves, but because they did it so informally that no permanent structures were needed or preserved. This casual attitude toward defecation created problems. Parasites, contaminated food, outbreaks of dysentery, and the people had no real concept of germ theory. They knew only that bad smells were bad omens, and perhaps God was punishing them with illness, but not because their chamber pots sat unemptied beside their porridge bowls. It would be centuries before that link was made. Still, medieval people weren't entirely without toilet etiquette. Some villages imposed basic rules, like not going near the well or avoiding fields just before harvest. Others had shit pits, communal holes dug on the outskirts for safety and modesty. And believe it or not, the word toilet wouldn't appear for many centuries yet. Instead, they used terms like necessarium, privy, draft house, or simply the place. So what did it mean to go to the bathroom in the early Middle Ages? It meant discomfort, improvisation, and a lot of exposure. It meant watching your step, avoiding certain alleys, holding your breath on warm days. It meant sharing chamber pots with your family, wiping with moss, straw, or nothing at all. And if you were a monk, it meant praying while pooping in silence in the cold. But most of all, it meant living in a world where waste was always present, never quite hidden, and rarely cleaned. A world where human byproducts flowed down the streets like forgotten ghosts of the empire that once piped them away. But most of all, it meant living in a world where waste was always present, never quite hidden, and rarely cleaned. A world where human byproducts flowed down the streets like forgotten ghosts of the empire that once piped them away. And if you think this was merely a temporary hiccup in European sanitation history, think again. This system, or rather, the absence of a system, persisted for centuries. In fact, many communities considered open defecation to be normal and even communal. Stories from Anglo-Saxon England recount how villagers might gather behind a hedge at dawn, squatting in a row, chatting, grunting, laughing, sharing the morning news while they shared the soil. In a way, the early medieval toilet break was a social activity. It wasn't just about bodily relief. It was about belonging, routine, and survival to Iron Norse settlements across Scandinavia. The frigid climate gave rise to creative, albeit still primitive, solutions. Latrines were built adjacent to longhouses, sometimes inside, partitioned by wooden panels and perfumed with dried herbs to keep spirits and smells at bay. Vikings understood the danger of cold exposure, so relieving oneself in the open was not just uncomfortable, it was lethal. Still, they had no plumbing. Waste was shoveled manually into pits or thrown into nearby bodies of water. Interestingly, the Norse believed that cleanliness was tied not to morality, but to strength and status. While a Roman might consider bathing and toileting an act of civilization, a Viking might view it as preparation for war. They even had terms for the toilet warrior, one who emptied bowels before battle for speed and clarity. In contrast, in southern Europe, especially in formerly Roman territories like Italy or Gaul, there lingered a certain nostalgia for the sanitation systems of old. Ruins of Roman baths and aqueducts stood as solemn reminders of what once was. In these regions, the wealthy elite sometimes tried to replicate ancient habits. Some noble estates attempted to build crude versions of Roman latrines with brick, seats, and gravity-fed drainage channels. But without proper maintenance or engineering expertise, these usually failed within a generation. Meanwhile, in early Islamic Spain, under the Umayyads, things were very different. Muslim hygiene law emphasized ritual cleanliness, and even in the 8th century, cities like Cordoba had latrines with flowing water and even rudimentary toilet paper made from cloth or leaves. The stark contrast between Andalusia and the rest of Christian Europe was night and day. While peasants in Burgundy squatted in bushes, Moorish scholars discussed the theological implications of wiping techniques. But for the vast majority of Europeans, the toilet remained a personal struggle, and often a painful one. With poor sanitation came the rise of parasites, particularly intestinal worms. Children suffered from roundworm infections that led to chronic malnutrition. Adults dealt with tapeworms, sometimes stretching feet long, living in the gut for years. The lack of soap, combined with dirty hands and contaminated food, led to constant outbreaks of dysentery, causing violent diarrhea, dehydration, and death. Whole communities were occasionally wiped out, not by sword or plague, but by filth. The Middle Ages were not merely brutal. They were constipated, contagious, and crusted with decay. And then there were the smells. Oh, the smells, historical. Accounts describe entire quarters of early medieval towns as fetid swamps of human excrement, particularly during the summer months. Travelers wrote of the unbearable stench in London, Paris, or Cologne, where narrow streets funneled odor like chimney flues. One monk, writing in the 9th century, referred to the air of his abbey as suffocating with the scent of brotherly sacrifice. Charming, superstition, of course, ran wild in such conditions. Many believed that evil spirits dwelled in latrines, especially after dark. It was common for people to carry charms, incantation tablets, or Christian relics with them when they went to relieve themselves in the night, fearing demonic attacks while in such a vulnerable position. Some even insisted on going in pairs, not for conversation, but for spiritual protection. And if this all seems a little silly, remember, in an age where the average life expectancy barely crossed 35, and where death came easily through tainted water or a fly landing on your bread, people clung to anything that offered meaning, or at least comfort. By the late early medieval period, around the 10th century, some progress began to return slowly. Larger towns began to designate specific defecation zones, some with wooden screens for privacy. Basic cesspits were dug deeper, sometimes lined with stone, and rudimentary waste management began to be considered, mostly out of desperation. But these were the exceptions. For the most part, toileting in the early Middle Ages was an act of raw necessity, performed in the elements, without comfort, and rarely in solitude. And while kings and abbots might have had slightly more privacy, they still shared the same fate as the peasant. No plumbing, no toilet paper, and no escape from the smell, if the fall of Rome had cast civilization into the shadows. The disappearance of sanitation had buried it in something far more pungent. But among all the filth, stench, and squatting in the grass, there was one place in Europe where an attempt at order, however feeble, still lingered: the monasteries. Yes, believe it or not, behind the stone walls and candlelit halls of early medieval abbeys, monks were among the few who treated toilet use not just as a biological act, but as a spiritual ritual. Why? Because when you have nothing else to control in your life, no wife, no wealth, no weapons, you tend to cling to routine. And monks? They were nothing if not obsessed with routine. Take the Benedictine rule, one of the most widely followed monastic guidelines across Europe, written in the 6th century. It never directly mentions the toilet. And yet, everything about monastic life was structured to the second, including when and where a monk could relieve himself. In many monasteries, latrines were built at the end of long corridors, often as part of what we now call the reredo order, a charming medieval term that basically means the place where brothers go to defecate in silence. These latrines were usually long benches with multiple holes, lined up over a running stream or deep pit. No walls, no privacy, just you, your brothers in faith, and your thoughts about eternity, and you had to be silent. That was the rule. No talking, no laughing, no commentary on last night's lentil stew. Only the quiet plop of spiritual release, echoing in the stillness that if you broke the silence rule, say, a nervous fart or a whispered prayer, you might find yourself in trouble. Monks who broke toilet discipline were assigned penance, fasting, prayer, or cleaning duty. And make no mistake, cleaning in a monastery wasn't just sweeping the cloisters. It meant shoveling human waste out of the latrine pit using a bucket and prayer. Still, these monastic efforts gave birth to something remarkable: the early return of infrastructure. In some abbeys, water was rerouted to help carry waste away. Stone-lined pits were constructed to contain smells. Latrines were built into walls so waste could drop into the river below. Sound familiar? It should. These were the proto-garderobes, precursors to the castle toilets we'll meet in Part 3. But don't be fooled into thinking monks were all clean and godly. Some abbeys were notorious for their filth. One chronicle from 10th century France described how an entire monastic wing had to be abandoned because the latrine trench overflowed and ran beneath the dormitory, stinking so badly it summoned flies in winter. Even saints weren't safe. Saint Columbanus, an Irish monk famous for his austerity, once refused to use the communal latrine because he believed it tempted him with worldly comfort. Instead, he dug his own pit in the woods and continued his holy contemplation surrounded by beetles and decay. And in case you're wondering, yes, monks wiped. With what? Often moss, grass, or handfuls of straw. Sometimes they used ceramic shards or wooden scrapers. And they did it without speaking. Imagine the discipline. Outside the monasteries, however, chaos reigned. Villages expanded without planning. Towns rose haphazardly around crumbling Roman roads. Cesspits dug too close to wells led to waterborne diseases. In England, archaeological digs reveal entire layers of medieval soil darkened by night soil, the polite term for human excrement, slowly mixed with ashes and straw. So if you're picturing the early Middle Ages as a land of knights and legends, think again. Before the armor came on, before the sword was raised, and before the tales were told, there was always a morning squat, a cold breeze on the bottom, and a prayer that the smell wouldn't stick to your robes all day. And yet, somehow, out of this disorder came innovation. By the 11th century, a new trend was beginning to rise, literally. Castles, massive stone structures, symbols of power and dominance. And with them came the first elevated toilets in centuries, garderobes, little chambers that jutted out from high towers, sending waste plummeting into the moats below. If you thought squatting in the bushes with your neighbors was the worst the Middle Ages had to offer, prepare yourself. Because the nobility, the very people who ruled, taxed, and waged wars, were relieving themselves in places so aesthetically majestic and structurally questionable. You might never look at a castle the same way again. Let us ascend into the grand world of garderobes. Now, don't let the French name fool you. A garderobe wasn't a wardrobe, although the words do share an origin. In castles, a garderobe was a small, enclosed toilet chamber, usually tucked into the turret walls, often built into the thick stone to protrude ever so slightly outside the structure. Imagine a small stone cubicle sticking out from a castle tower, with a hole carved into the stone bench and nothing but the open air below. You sat, you dropped, and gravity did the rest. Where did it land? If you were lucky or unlucky, depending on your role, it fell directly into the moat. That's right. The same moat that was meant to stop invaders was often a poop-filled cesspool. Forget the dramatic images of valiant knights swimming through pristine water to storm the castle. In reality, they'd have to wade through decades of noble excrement, decomposing food, and whatever else the servants couldn't carry out. The smell? Imagine a summer's day in southern France. Now imagine that same day spent downwind of the castle's east wall. That's where the garderobes usually jutted out. Why the east? Well, they didn't have Febreze, but they did have wind patterns. And some bright medieval architect figured out that if you put your privy where the wind blew the smell away from the castle, well, you'd sleep easier at night. But let's step into one of these medieval powder rooms for a closer look. They were small, cramped, sometimes barely wider than a person. The walls were stone, the seat usually a plank with a round hole, and occasionally there was a wooden lid to keep out the smell or animals. Yes, rats and birds were known to climb up the shafts seeking warmth or the occasional snack. If that gives you chills, imagine being a 12th century baron, mid-process, and hearing a flutter below. And yet, this was considered elite. Why? Because unlike the peasants who had to carry their own waste, the lords and ladies had gravity and servants to deal with it. In fact, in large castles, entire teams of workers were responsible for cleaning the latrines, emptying the cesspits when they became too full. The job was as foul as you'd imagine, and usually relegated to the lowest-ranking servants or even criminals doing penance. These men were called gong farmers in later centuries, but in earlier medieval times, they were known only by their function. And their noses? Likely dead inside. And what of royal hygiene? Surely the kings and queens had something more refined than just sitting above a chute? Oh, they did. Let's talk about wiping. In the absence of toilet paper, which wouldn't arrive in Europe for many more centuries. Nobles used whatever soft, disposable material was available. And the wealthy, being wealthy, didn't want leaves or straw. They had linen cloths, cut into squares and discarded after use. There's even evidence that some courts kept perfumed cloths, likely soaked in rose water, to make the experience a bit more luxurious. And what if you didn't want to wipe yourself? Enter one of the most peculiar and intimate roles in medieval court life. The groom of the stool. This was not a joke. This was a royal office, held by a trusted courtier, always male, whose sole duty was to attend to the king during his bowel movements. He would prepare the toilet, manage the linen, and even assist with wiping if required. Far from being mocked, the groom of the stool was often one of the king's closest advisors, because where else would you have such candid conversations? Now, while this position reached its peak under the Tudors, the seeds were planted much earlier. Court attendants had long been expected to serve their lords in all things, and toileting was no exception. Nobles often had ornate commodes, portable wooden thrones with padded lids, designed to hold chamber pots. These were sometimes carried to banquets, bedrooms, or battlefields, lest one be caught without proper facilities. But let's not pretend this was all elegance and etiquette. Many castles, especially in the early medieval period, lacked sufficient plumbing or drainage. Garderobes often became clogged, the shafts filled with human sludge, requiring laborers to descend into the cesspits with shovels. In some cases, it was so bad that plagues of flies would rise from beneath the garderobe, infesting the castle kitchens nearby. Several chroniclers of the time mention castle cooks swatting insects between courses, and while stone walls offered privacy, they didn't insulate sound or smell. It wasn't uncommon for lords to dine on roast goose while hearing the echo of someone upstairs having a medieval moment. Etiquette manuals eventually emerged in the 13th and 14th centuries, instructing nobles to close the garderobe lid, to avoid using the latrine during meals, and this one is real, not to toss used linen out the window. A fine reminder that even the nobility needed constant guidance when it came to waste management. But even among all the stench and scandal, the castle garderobe represented something critical: the return of structure. Unlike the chaotic pits of early medieval villages, these toilets were designed, built, and maintained. They reflected a growing awareness that waste needed to be managed, not just ignored. That comfort, privacy, and yes, even dignity had a place, however drafty, within the walls of power. Yet, for all their grandeur, these toilets were deeply flawed. Asterisk in times of siege, when the castle's supply lines were cut, garderobes became a liability. Enemies knew to block the waste chutes, forcing castles to become cesspools from within. There are stories of besieged nobles forced to relieve themselves in buckets and throw the contents from the walls in desperation. Not exactly chivalrous. Still, it was better than squatting in a trench. And for nobles, everything was a matter of rank. Even how you pooped, from royal perfumed linens to poop chutes over the moat. The noble throne was far more than a metaphor. But what about the rest of society? The merchants, the city dwellers, the poor souls living under the very walls of these castles. What did they do when nature called? And then there's one of the most delightfully disgusting facts of all. In many medieval castles, garderobes doubled as closets. Yes, you heard that correctly. In a strange twist of medieval logic, people would sometimes hang their clothes inside, or near the garderobe chamber. Why? Because it was believed that the ammonia-heavy fumes from the human waste below would kill fleas and lice hiding in the garments. So, instead of lavender sachets or cedarwood drawers, you had a closet that smelled like the sewer. It wasn't just tolerated. It was intentional. One 14th century nobleman reportedly hung his fur-lined winter cloak directly over the toilet shaft for protection against infestation. If you're wondering whether you'd rather have fleas or a coat that smells like poop gas, well, medieval life was all about such cheerful compromises. And speaking of compromises, we mustn't ignore how noble women navigated the privy life. Unlike their male counterparts, noble women had to balance modesty, status, and biology in an enviable trinity. Most highborn ladies wore gowns with multiple layers, tight bodices, and heavy skirts. Going to the garderobe wasn't a quick affair. It was an operation. They would often have ladies-in-waiting assist them in undressing, holding up layers of skirts, and even cleaning afterward. There are recorded inventories from royal households listing personal cloths, scented waters, and silver washing bowls specifically used for cleaning after toileting. Yes, even hygiene had a class system, and they didn't always use the garderobe in private chambers. Noble women often had chamber pots, sometimes made of bronze or porcelain, elegantly decorated and hidden behind silk curtains or in wooden cabinets. Some pots were shaped like animals, some were disguised as stools, and some were so fancy they probably cost more than the average peasant's house. But even elegance couldn't mask the underlying truth. Waste still had to go somewhere, and while nobles had the means to distance themselves from their own filth, the cracks in the system were starting to show, especially during times of crisis. Take the 14th century, a time of growing urbanization, political unrest, and the Black Death. When plague arrived, the already flawed sanitation systems of the nobility collapsed under the weight of fear. Many castle garderobes and cesspits were abandoned, filled to the brim, or simply sealed off. In some regions, panic led to the destruction of latrines altogether. People believed the disease came from the smell, so they blocked waste shafts, locked garderobes, and forced even nobles to use chamber pots in open courtyards. Some turned to bizarre alternatives. There are records of aristocrats storing rose petals and crushed emeralds near their commodes to ward off bad humors. Others carried perfumed gloves or stuffed oranges filled with herbs to mask the stench, because nothing screams royalty like sniffing fruit while pooping in fear. Worse yet, the noble ideal of cleanliness began to unravel. With fewer servants willing to clean latrines or empty pots, many of them dying from plague, entire castle wings were reportedly sealed off due to overwhelming stench. Privies became tombs of rot. Linen rags went unwashed. People began defecating behind tapestries or into fireplaces. The throne, it seemed, had lost its dignity, and yet, even in the face of pestilence, nobles clung to their rituals. In the court of France, physicians debated which direction a toilet should face to prevent illness. In England, privy construction was briefly halted and redesigned to vent upward, away from courtyards. In Italy, noble families began paying artisans to create painted toilet seats to lift the mood, because nothing says resilience like sitting on a fresco of Saint Sebastian while contemplating the sins of last night's boar stew. Despite all their flaws, the garderobes remained symbols of privilege. They were cold, drafty, and perpetually smelly, but they lifted the elite above the muck, both figuratively and literally. You weren't just dropping waste. You were dropping from a height over your subjects, your moat, or the rats in the alley below. It was medieval power in its most primal form. But outside the castles, something more chaotic and far more public was festering in the winding alleys of medieval cities, where tenements crowded against each other and chamber pots overflowed from every window. Sanitation had taken on a more dramatic flair. The nobles had their garderobes. The townsfolk had their lungs, legs, and lightning-fast reflexes. If you think castle toilets were medieval madness, just wait until you step into the streets. Because in the cities of medieval Europe, privacy was a luxury and dignity was optional. The urban sanitation system, or more accurately, the lack thereof, was something to behold, and smell, and run from. Imagine this. You're strolling down a narrow alleyway in 14th century Paris. The buildings lean in like they're whispering secrets. The cobblestones are slick with, well, you're not sure. You hear a creak from above, a wooden shutter swings open, and a cheerful voice yells something that sounds like "Gardaloo." You don't know what it means, but instinct kicks in. You dive out of the way just in time to avoid a flying stream of human waste cascading from a chamber pot 3 stories up. Welcome to the neighborhood. The term "Gardaloo" comes from the French phrase "garde à l'eau," literally, watch out for the water. But this wasn't water. It was whatever had accumulated in the family's chamber pot since the last time someone braved emptying it. And it wasn't just once a day. It was a routine. Every morning and evening, households would toss their waste directly into the streets. Some made it to the gutters. Others didn't. If you were a pedestrian, you lived your life in a state of constant vigilance. Hats weren't just for sun protection. They were shields against poop. In many towns, the streets were open sewers. People defecated in alleys, against walls, or directly into public waterways. Waste trickled down the sloped roads toward rivers, or just collected in the corners like a revolting soup. Horses added to the chaos. Dogs, too. And don't forget the occasional rotting food, blood from butchers, or the inexplicably placed dead fish. You didn't walk through a medieval city. You waited, but surely, someone tried to stop this madness? Yes. Eventually, city authorities across Europe began issuing laws, often very specific, always very ignored. In 14th century London, it became illegal to throw dung, urine, or foul matter of any kind from windows. Offenders could be fined, flogged, or publicly humiliated. In Paris, there were fines for emptying chamber pots into the street before certain hours. In Florence, you could be punished for not cleaning your own waste from the gutter outside your shop. In Prague, they tried to introduce wooden latrines over streams, but for every rule, there were 20 excuses. Enforcement was spotty, and people always found loopholes. Oh no, that wasn't feces. That was last night's stew gone bad. Or my chamber pot slipped from my hand. Or the ever useful, it wasn't me. It was the neighbor. Worse, cities grew faster than they could manage their filth. As towns expanded and tenements multiplied, the situation worsened. The richer you were, the higher your apartment, and the farther your waste had to fall. Living on the bottom floor meant living with everyone else's excrement raining down from above. It wasn't just disgusting, it was dangerous. Diseases like dysentery, cholera, and typhoid stalked the streets like invisible reapers. It became a class issue, too. The poor lived closest to the ground. The rich, higher floors, fresher air, cleaner shoes. That is, until a gust of wind caught your flying chamber pot midair and redirected it into a merchant's awning. Medieval justice had a way of being poetic, but let's not forget what happened inside. The homes, chamber pots were essential items in every household. They came in all shapes and materials: clay, pewter, bronze, even silver for the wealthy. Some were plain. Some were decorated with saints or floral patterns, because nothing says refined like relieving yourself into a pot with the Virgin Mary painted on it. Emptying them was a job no one wanted, but someone had to do it. Often children, servants, or the poorest of the poor were tasked with carrying the pot through the house, down the stairs, out the door, and, hopefully, to a designated dumping zone. More often than not, it just got sloshed into the nearest gutter. And yes, sometimes it spilled. There were stories of chamber pot accidents so spectacular that they became the stuff of legend. One man in Bruges reportedly slipped on his neighbor's discarded waste, broke his leg, and sued for damages. The court ruled in his favor. The neighbor had to pay the equivalent of 2 weeks' wages and publicly apologize for aggressive defecation. But not all sanitation was impromptu. Some cities actually invested in communal latrines. In London, by the 13th century, public latrines called houses of easement began to appear over rivers and creeks. These were simple wooden structures with benches and holes, sometimes with separate sections for men and women, though not always. They were supposed to empty directly into flowing water, but often just overflowed back into the streets. In Lübeck, a city in Germany, they built stone latrine towers that drained into canals. In Paris, cesspits beneath public toilets were emptied by gong farmers, workers whose job was to dig out the waste, carry it out of the city, and dump it in nearby fields. They were paid well but lived apart from others, often shunned for the stench that clung to them. And yet, they were essential, because without them, waste simply piled up. In some towns, entire neighborhoods became known for their smell. People described walking through certain districts as passing through hell with open eyes and pinched noses. There were religious implications, too. Some theologians argued that sanitation was part of spiritual cleanliness. Others believed that suffering foul smells was part of earthly penance. One friar wrote that enduring the stench of humanity was to share in the suffering of Christ. That's one way to look at it. Another is, you're just knee-deep in poop. There were attempts at innovation. In Venice, where space was scarce, waste was collected in sealed barrels and rowed out to sea. In Bruges, some tenement owners tried to install waste chutes that funneled chamber pots directly into the street, saving tenants the trouble of opening a window. These often became clogged and exploded. And of course, there were the rats. With waste came rats, and with rats came plague. Urban sanitation became a matter of survival. After the Black Death swept across Europe, some cities began to take cleanliness seriously. Streets were washed, cesspits regulated, and waste collection became more organized. But it took centuries. And even then, chamber pot tossing didn't die out easily. It became a cultural joke, a shared experience, a warning to visitors. Keep your eyes up and your mouth closed. Because in the city, everyone was under fire. Next time you curse at a traffic jam or roll your eyes at a clogged toilet, remember, once upon a time, people lived in cities where your greatest danger wasn't crime or disease. It was being pooped on by your neighbor's grandmother. And yet, somehow, humanity survived. Now, if you're thinking, surely people didn't just accept this popocalypse lying down, you're partially right. They didn't lie down, because lying down meant pressing your face a little too close to the street. But it was accepted. It was normalized. So much so that in cities like York or Bruges, chamber pot tossing became part of the urban rhythm, like the tolling of church bells or the clip-clop of horseshoes. The plop of porcelain on cobblestone was just background noise. That what's even more absurd is that fashion made things worse. Long, flowing dresses, pointed shoes, trailing capes, medieval city fashion, was a health hazard in itself. A noblewoman could spend hours preparing her appearance only to step out and return with half of yesterday's street soup soaked into her velvet hem. And do you think people kept quiet about it? Oh no. If medieval Europe had a Twitter equivalent, it was court records. The legal documents of the time are filled with complaints about flying waste. Mistress Yvonne's pot struck my hat. Or, I was soiled in the street without warning. Or, my dignity and cloak are forever stained. Satirists and poets also had a field day. One 14th century French poem refers to a city street as the devil's armpit, damp with sin and stink. English ballads mocked the thunderpots of London. And in Florence, civic murals actually depicted people being hit with flying excrement, a not-so-subtle way to warn newcomers. Wear a hood and keep your mouth shut. But while the rich had some distance from this horror show, the poor bore the brunt. They lived closest to the street, worked in it, sold bread beside it, and slept just a wooden floor above it. In tenement housing, waste from multiple families was poured into the same alley. The stench seeped through floorboards, through dreams, into memory. And for women, it was uniquely degrading. In public, there was no space for privacy. Chamber pots might be hidden under skirts, or used in doorways while someone held up a cloak. During festivals, it wasn't uncommon to see someone casually urinating against a church wall while the choir sang inside. Men had it easier. They could walk up to any alley or bush and take care of business. Women had to be creative or just hold it until the pain was biblical. But even within this filth, people found a strange sort of routine. Just like we time our mornings by coffee. In traffic, medieval citizens learned when the streets were safer. The early morning pot drop was legendary. Locals avoided alleyways at dawn like modern commuters avoid construction zones. Street cleaners, when they existed, were brave souls. Some cities employed rakers to scrape muck into piles and cart it away. In Cologne, certain guilds were responsible for sanitation on feast days. And in Paris, teenage boys were hired to carry buckets of water and refresh the streets. How effective this was is questionable. Still, innovation slowly crept in. By the late Middle Ages, cities began experimenting with covered drains, primitive sewers running beneath the main streets. In Prague, a 14th century plan included stone-lined channels under the roads to redirect waste toward rivers. In London, the Great Conduit was constructed to bring clean water in. But they quickly realized that bringing water out was a far greater issue. So came the cesspits. Holes dug beneath houses or communal spaces to collect waste until someone, usually a gong farmer or nightman, dug it out. Cesspits were meant to be sealed and serviced. But when people grew lazy or cheap, they just let them fill. Over time, the earth beneath homes turned into bubbling reservoirs of despair. It wasn't unheard of for floors to collapse into overflowing cesspits. Imagine it. You're eating your dinner, and suddenly you're waist deep in last winter's stew. Only, it's not stew, and it's not last winter. City ordinances started getting more dramatic. In 15th century London, the mayor issued decrees declaring certain neighborhoods waste zones and taxed homeowners who didn't maintain proper cesspits. In Florence, repeat offenders could be banished from the city. Yes, banished for being bad at poop, but for all the rules, all the fines, and all the revolting consequences, the core problem remained. There was no system, no citywide sewage infrastructure, no uniform waste removal, no real understanding of sanitation. They hadn't made the mental leap between filth and illness. To them, a dirty street wasn't a health hazard. It was just Tuesday. And yet, they managed. People adapted. They wore thicker boots, They trained their ears to recognize the creak of a shutter. They built stronger awnings, learned to sprint under balconies, and held their breath like athletes during the summer dumping games. Eventually, things began to shift. In the centuries to come, plumbing would appear. Hygiene would rise in value. Diseases would be traced not to sin or smell, but to microbes. But in the medieval city, you survived with your instincts, your cloak, and a very strong stomach. Because, in the Middle Ages, it wasn't just your soul that needed saving. Sometimes it was your hat. If cities were chaotic toilets in the open air, monasteries were the quiet, solemn attempt to control the chaos, with mixed results. When one imagines medieval monks, we often think of them as silent figures cloaked in brown robes, pacing echoing. Cloisters, their days structured by the rhythm of prayer bells. And indeed, for many of them, that was true. But hidden between their devotions to God and their hand-copied manuscripts was the eternal, undeniable truth of the human body. Everyone still had to poop, and monks had to do it on schedule. Monastic life was built around regula, a rule, most famously, the rule of Saint Benedict, written in the 6th century. This rule did not merely dictate prayer and humility. It also governed the logistics of eating, sleeping, and, yes, toileting. Because cleanliness, while not necessarily next to godliness, was certainly somewhere in the same cloister, the layout of a medieval monastery often included a reredo d'order, a term that sounds like a Harry Potter spell, but actually means latrine block. This was a long, shared toilet area, often attached to the dormitory, so monks could stumble to it in the night without having to cross freezing courtyards in their sandals. Imagine a long stone bench with several evenly spaced holes, no partitions, and no privacy. The waste would drop into a running water channel underneath, if the monastery was lucky enough to have one. Otherwise, it was a pit of piety. Using the reredo d'order was not a casual affair. There were rules. According to some surviving texts, monks were expected to go to the toilet at designated times, often before or after group prayers. They were to enter in silence, keep their eyes down, and not speak while in the latrine. No greetings, no chit-chat, definitely no eye contact. Just quiet, solemn excretion, and the tools? Far from golden or noble, but functional. Some monasteries used communal wiping rags, stored in baskets or hung on pegs. These would be washed regularly, ideally, but let's not pretend hygiene was anywhere near modern standards. More inventive monasteries kept bowls of clean sand or ash nearby, which could be used to scrub oneself clean. Now, while the idea of monks lining up for silent pooping sounds amusing, and it is, there was genuine spiritual meaning to it. Bodily functions were seen as reminders of human frailty, of our descent from Eden, of the burden of flesh. In relieving themselves, monks weren't just emptying their bowels. They were enacting the quiet rituals of humility. They were confronting the beastly side of man and keeping it tucked neatly within the stone walls of God's house. Of course, not all monasteries were equal. The wealthier orders, especially Cistercians and Cluniacs, constructed elaborate sanitation systems. The Abbey of Cluny in France had a flowing water system beneath its latrines, using diverted river channels. The monks could relieve themselves while listening to the gentle trickle of divine engineering. But poorer abbeys? They were closer to rural outhouses than sacred architectural marvels. And then came discipline. Woe unto the monk who defiled the reredo d'order by, say, talking during his business, or sneaking in during unassigned hours. Some orders recorded penances for misusing the toilet, fasting, extra prayers, even exclusion from communal meals. In the spiritual economy of the cloister, Improper pooping could lead to very real punishment, and yet, monks weren't entirely. Joyless Point 1 13th century manuscript includes a small drawing of a monk farting on a demon, using his rear end to ward off temptation. Crude humor, it seems, was not entirely absent behind monastery walls. Even the pious needed to laugh at the human condition. There were also monastic latrine stories, passed down like cautionary tales. Point one tale speaks of a monk so proud of his silence and discipline that he refused to speak even when a fellow brother fainted in the latrine. Another story tells of a novice who fell into the waste pit and was only rescued after 2 hours of prayer because no one was allowed to scream or panic during cloister time. And if you think this is strange, remember, the toilet wasn't just functional. It was symbolic that it reminded monks daily of their mortality, of the dirtiness of sin, of the fragility of flesh. In fact, some mystics wrote that the smell of the latrine was a holy test, a way to strengthen the soul against worldly temptation. While the secular world tossed waste into the street and cursed the smell, monks sat quietly in their latrine benches, breathing in the odor of salvation. In the end, monastic hygiene wasn't about comfort. It was about order, penance, and reflection. A world where you could commune with God and your fellow monks over a shared pit latrine, a place where even the flush of humility echoed through stone corridors. Of course, not every monk was a model of pious plumbing. Hidden deep in the scrolls of monastic discipline records are stories of transgressions. There were those who couldn't resist sneaking in snacks and eating in the latrines, because it was one of the few places where one could be alone. Others carved graffiti into the stone walls. One famous carving in a 12th century English monastery reads simply, "Here I sat and thought of sin." And we cannot ignore the night-soiled dilemmas. Many monasteries, particularly in colder regions, maintain chamber pots for nighttime use. These pots, stored under wooden beds or in the dormitorium, had to be emptied each morning. Guess who had to do it? Not the abbot. Novices, of course. Young, wide-eyed boys who joined the monastery with dreams of scripture and spiritual awakening were often introduced to the religious life via a sloshing pot of someone else's regrets. The task was to carry the pot, usually without a lid, down winding stone steps to the reredorer or a dung heap, all before sunrise. Many an aspiring theologian met humility early, yet in some ways, monasteries were centuries ahead of their time. Take the Great Drain of Westminster Abbey, an actual engineering marvel of the 13th century. This massive culvert system, built to flush waste away from the abbey's latrines using diverted river water, remained in service for hundreds of years. While peasants just outside the abbey walls were squatting behind haystacks, the monks were enjoying a kind of proto-sewage luxury that wouldn't be seen again until Victorian London. Even so, latrine design was never truly comfortable. No heated seats, no doors, no privacy. But the regularity, the ritual of monastic toileting fostered a deep psychological connection between the body and the soul. Some mystics even elevated their own bowel suffering into spiritual metaphors. There's a 14th century Carthusian monk who wrote that the bowel is the devil's grip, and release is a form of exorcism. And if you think that's a bit dramatic, you've clearly never had medieval food. Interestingly, many monastic rules emphasized bathing less than toileting. Clean hands were important, clean feet, too, but full-body bathing was often seen as indulgent, even tempting. One abbey allowed only 3 baths per year, but toileting, that had to happen. The body had to obey. Regularity was godliness, and for the poor monk with stomach problems, well, in some orders, chronic digestive issues were seen as a sign of spiritual imbalance or even possession. The infirmary kept laxative prayers on hand, chants that monks would recite while awaiting relief. One ancient recipe calls for figs soaked in vinegar with a psalm recitation. Clean me with hyssop, and I shall be whiter than snow. Even death didn't free monks from toilet-related duty. In some traditions, a dead brother's last chamber pot was ceremonially cleaned by the community. In death, as in life, the body's waste was a shared burden, a reminder of mortality. A memento mori in ceramic form. It might seem strange, even grotesque, that so much thought and theology surrounded something so earthy. But that was the essence of monasticism, taking the base and elevating it, turning even the lowliest action into a whisper of worship. Next time you're sitting comfortably on your modern porcelain throne, remember the monks who sat in silence, knees touching in the cold stone latrines, chanting psalms over shared sponges and thinking deeply, not just about their faith, but also about where it all goes when we're done with it. Because in the monastery, even poop had purpose. If monks taught us that toileting could be humble, then royalty reminded the world that it could also be theatrical. Let's begin in 17th century France, where King Louis XIV, the Sun King himself, conducted much of his royal business, while on his very own toilet throne. Yes, the king had an audience while relieving himself. Louis XIV had what was called a chaise percée, a padded armchair with a discreet hole and a removable chamber pot underneath. It was upholstered in velvet, trimmed with gold, and placed in a private but not so private chamber. You see, in the royal court of Versailles, even bodily functions were political theater. Louis would rise each morning to a strict ceremonial routine called the levee, and at times during this ritual, he would be seated on the throne, not the one with the crown, but the one with the smell. Courtiers would crowd the room as Louis did his business, bowing, whispering requests, delivering documents. Why? Because being in the king's presence, even while he pooped, was a sign of favor. Power radiated from his every orifice. Now before you clutch your pearls, Louis wasn't the only monarch to mix statecraft with the call of nature. In fact, the royal toilet, if it existed at all, was often a status symbol. And where there was royalty, there were toilet servants. In Tudor England, such a role reached its strange zenith in the form of the groom of the stool. That is not a joke. That was the official title of the courtier who attended the monarch during his most personal moments. The groom was in charge of overseeing the king's bowel movements, bringing in water, cloths, and perfumes, helping him undress, even offering advice as the king sat and contemplated both his kingdom and digestion. The position was considered highly prestigious, not because it was glamorous, it wasn't, but because the groom had unparalleled private access to the king. And where there is privacy, there is trust. And where there is trust, there is power. Under Henry VIII, the groom of the stool was so powerful that he influenced royal appointments and policy. Imagine your boss's toilet assistant deciding who gets promoted in the office. Now let's visit Queen Elizabeth I. The Virgin Queen had her own set of quirks when it came to toileting. Her chamber pot was lined with scented herbs and fresh petals because, while hygiene was primitive, olfactory illusion was everything. Elizabeth was famously fastidious, and while she was known to bathe less than we might expect, she took great care to preserve a sweet scent around her person, especially in the loo. She also had a custom-built close stool, an early form of toilet disguised as an elegant piece of furniture. These stools were often carved, padded, and matched the decor of the chamber. From a distance, it looked like a noblewoman's favorite sitting chair. Up close, it was more sitting than chair. Interestingly, bathroom privacy for royalty was never guaranteed. The concept of a private lavatory didn't truly emerge until modern plumbing. Before then, kings and queens went wherever made sense, behind a tapestry, in a chamber pot, or, like Louis, right in front of their advisors. And yes, there were accidents. Point one record from the court of Charles II notes that a duchess fainted after stumbling upon a duke mid-defecation behind a curtain. He had mistaken the corner for discretion. She mistook the curtain for a dressing nook. Awkward was an understatement. Even royal travel required careful toilet planning. Portable commodes were carried by footmen, and stopping for a royal poop break was part of the itinerary. One French princess reportedly refused to continue a journey when her preferred toileting tent was forgotten. Wars paused. Carriages halted. Nature, after all, bowed for no crown. There are even letters between royal families discussing toilet preferences. My sister prefers the English chamber pot, though I find the German style more comfortable. Diplomacy, sometimes, began in the bathroom. But the most outrageous example of all may be Tsar Peter the Great of Russia, a man obsessed with modernization and hygiene in a rather twisted way. Peter reportedly held informal court sessions inside bathhouses, steam rising, ministers sweating, and yes, toileting included. One guest described the experience as equal parts sauna, sermon, and sewer. And yet, for all this, royal toileting habits were merely reflections of their times. Just as peasants squatted over holes and monks shared benches, kings too had their own rituals, draped in silk, perfumed with lavender, yet undeniably human. They, too, strained. They, too, smelled. They, too, groaned. And in those private, or not so private, moments, the veil between ruler and ruled thinned, if only slightly. Because whether on a velvet throne or a wooden bench, we all answer nature's call. The only difference? Some had a valet to wipe. Let us now drift across the channel and head north, to the misty moors of Scotland, where Mary, Queen of Scots, left behind not just tales of political intrigue, but also toilet rumors that scandalized her. Enemies. English spies once reported that Mary's servants dried her chamber pot by placing it under her bed to keep it warm for the next use. Whether that's true or 16th century gossip weaponized, it reveals how deeply bodily habits were entangled. With public image.in fact, toileting was often politicized during royal negotiations or foreign visits. Hosting dignitaries sometimes required loaning them a commode of acceptable standard. When the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V visited England, he was given a gilded chamber pot inlaid with enamel crests, a sign of respect, but also surveillance, because servants would later inspect its contents. Why? In case his stool revealed illness, weakness, or worse, poisoning. Yes, medieval and early modern monarchies had what today we'd call toilet intelligence. The contents of a royal bowel movement could be studied like tea leaves. Too runny? Worrisome. Too dark? Possibly. Diseased. Too dry? Send for figs and a physician. Court doctors often evaluated the king's health by personally examining his stool, reporting back with grave concern, as though it were a state document. Nowhere was this taken more seriously than at the court of Frederick the Great of Prussia. Frederick maintained a detailed logbook of his bowel movements, which he annotated in Latin with notes like fortis odor, sed regularis, strong odor, but regular. These logs were not private. They were reviewed by his physician and sometimes read aloud to attendants. In the military-obsessed Prussian court, even digestion became a measure of discipline. Meanwhile, in China's Forbidden City, imperial toilet culture had its own grandeur. The emperor's chamber pot, often made of jade or cloisonne, was attended by eunuchs, who were trained not only in emptying and cleaning, but also in silence. Their discretion was paramount. An emperor's bowel schedule was part of court routine, and during certain dynasties, it was considered an omen if his routine shifted unexpectedly. Astrologers would be consulted. Rituals might be postponed. After all, how could the mandate of heaven be strong if the emperor's bowels were weak? Back in Europe, royal toileting remained a curious blend of comfort and spectacle. Queen Marie Antoinette, for instance, had a private toileting pavilion in her Petit Trianon, complete with embroidered curtains and gold-trimmed basins. Yet even she, when traveling, had to endure the indignity of public roadside relief, guarded by soldiers holding up cloaks as makeshift walls. And what about Napoleon Bonaparte? Despite his militaristic image, Napoleon had a very delicate digestion. He carried with him a collapsible silver chamber pot and was notorious for making battle decisions while seated upon it. In fact, the famed strategist once postponed an attack because, in his words, "My stomach is not yet agreeable." One could argue that bowel discomfort may have changed the course of history, but perhaps the most unexpected royal figure in this story is Queen Victoria. She was the first British monarch to truly embrace the early innovations of indoor plumbing. At Osborne House, her summer retreat, Victoria had a flushing toilet installed, a marvel of engineering and decorum. But she insisted that it be disguised. The chain had to be hidden behind a floral tapestry and the cistern painted with vines. Because while she welcomed sanitation, she did not welcome the word toilet. In fact, she preferred to call it the convenience. And so, among the pomp and circumstance, the jewels and thrones, every royal dynasty shared one private truth. The toilet was never just a place. It was a stage, sometimes velvet draped, sometimes gold trimmed, often absurd, but always human. As one French courtier once whispered after bowing to a duke who emerged from his toilet tent, "The noblest bowels in France, but they still stink like ours." Indeed, we tend to think of human waste as the ultimate disposable, something to be flushed away, forgotten, and never spoken of again, unless you're watching a YouTube video like this. But in the past, poop was power, before plumbing, before bleach. Before the modern flush turned our waste invisible, human excrement was a valuable, usable, sellable resource. It fertilized fields, softened leather, paid taxes, and, believe it or not, created an entire working class dedicated to handling it. Let's begin with the euphemistically titled night soil men. These were the unsung heroes of urban waste management. If your idea of a hero involves hauling buckets of feces at midnight. In cities across Europe and Asia, the night soil man would make his rounds after dark, carrying a long-handled scoop and bucket slung over his shoulders. He'd empty privies, cesspits, and chamber pots, sometimes through basement doors, sometimes by climbing up precarious wooden ladders to rooftop latrines in places like 17th century London or 18th century Edo, now Tokyo. This was a paid service. And the best collectors had loyal clients and fixed routes. They'd gather the waste and then sell it to farmers outside the city. Rich, organic fertilizer that helped grow the next season's crops. In short, today's lunch came from yesterday's dinner. This wasn't a marginal trade. In Edo, the rights to collect human waste from certain neighborhoods were auctioned off, with bidding wars among merchants. The more affluent the neighborhood, the more nutrient-rich the waste. The poor? Less fiber, less meat, less volume, less value. Poop had an economic hierarchy, but human waste wasn't just used for growing cabbage. In the tanning industry, it had a second career, particularly urine. Yes, your morning pee had market value. In pre-industrial Europe, Fulling mills and leather workshops used urine as a cleaning and softening agent. Ammonia in the urine broke down fats and helped remove hair from animal hides. Workers would literally stand ankle deep in tubs of urine, stomping on hides like grapes, to prepare leather for the market. Romans were so organized about this process that Emperor Vespasian implemented the urine tax, the vectigal urinae. Collectors placed jars outside public urinals, then sold the contents to tanners and launderers. Vespasian famously defended the tax with the phrase pecunia non olet, money does not stink. It became a Roman motto. It also became a public restroom chain. In modern-day Italy, you'll still find pay toilets named Vespasiani. Imagine living in a world where your toilet tribute supports public infrastructure. Meanwhile, in medieval cities, cesspits were rentable assets. If you own land with an underground cesspit, you could lease it to a neighboring household, charging fees for each use or for scheduled emptying. Waste management became a form of passive income. Though passive may be generous when your basement smells like 600 years of digestion. In some towns, the position of privy inspector existed, an official tasked with ensuring cesspits weren't overfilled, illegally drained into rivers, or shared without payment. Fines were levied. Court records survive. One man in 14th century Paris was sued by a neighbor for dumping excessive night soil into shared space and causing public alarm. Modern HOA drama had nothing on medieval poop feuds. Even monasteries managed their waste with economic foresight. Some larger abbeys collected manure, both animal and human, in large pits, mixed it with straw, and then sold it to local farmers. The monks themselves might have lived humbly, but their poop had a revenue stream. In China, farmers developed elaborate exchange systems with city households. In some cases, families would receive a discount on rent or grain in exchange for allowing their waste to be collected. Some contracts even specified who got first scoop rights. It was as bureaucratically detailed as any land lease. And then there was the early black market. If you couldn't afford the night soil service, you might dump your waste into rivers or vacant lots. But that wasn't always safe. Laws in 15th century. England fined people for illegal dumping, with penalties ranging from coins to lashes. In London, it was a public crime to pour filth after curfew, unless done by an authorized collector. These rules weren't about hygiene. They were about profit control. In short, medieval society had monetized the very stuff we now flush without thinking. There was dignity in dumb. There was power in pee. And for those living hand to mouth, or cheek to chamber pot, it was often the only business model they had access to. One man's waste was truly another's wage. And while we may now roll our eyes at waste management, the people of the past were busy managing it, selling it, taxing it, fighting over it, and somehow turning it into something that fed the world. Next time you flush, remember, you're literally throwing money down the drain. Of course, where there is economic value, there is always innovation. By the late Middle Ages and early Renaissance, entire guild-like systems began forming around the management of waste. In some German cities, night soil collection licenses were passed down like family heirlooms. Being a master dung hauler wasn't exactly the stuff of fairy tales, but it was steady work and more secure than being a wandering minstrel or, worse, a freelance theologian. These men, and occasionally women, developed techniques for maximizing extraction, tools with longer handles, odor-reducing sacks made from tar-lined cloth, and, most critically, early waste carts with sealable lids. Some had bells to warn people. The cart is coming. Close your windows. Not out of politeness, But because tipping buckets into the cart often resulted in a wave of foul air strong enough to knock over a chicken. Yet the most fascinating twist in this medieval fecal economy wasn't what came out the back end, but what it could be. In Edo period Japan, high-quality night soil could be exchanged for rice or fish, depending on the season. A farmer with a good contract might have better nutrition than a city artisan. In parts of rural England, manure agreements were embedded in dowries and marriage contracts, especially when transferring land rights. To have and to hold, for richer or for riper. Even the Vatican got in on the game. Documents from 15th century. Rome mentioned papal permissions for waste transport across district lines, because human waste, much like holy relics or noble corpses, had bureaucratic boundaries. You needed the right seal to cart dung from Trastevere to the Vatican Gardens, and, lest you think this system was unrefined, early urban planning was surprisingly poop-centric. When engineers in Baghdad rebuilt irrigation canals in the 9th century, they also designed waste divergence basins, separating clean water from night contributions that could then be repurposed downstream. These same channels fertilized orchards that fed the caliph's palace. Poop built empires. Quietly, organically, but not all of poop's economic legacy was nourishing. It could also be weaponized. During certain sieges, human waste became literal ammunition. Buckets of feces were launched over city walls using catapults or trebuchets to spread disease. In 1346, Mongol forces besieging the Genoese colony of Kaffa allegedly flung plague-infected corpses and excrement over the walls, an act some historians believe helped spark the Black Death spread into Europe. And so yes, economics, agriculture, and germ warfare, all united by the humble turd. But what happened to this centuries-old value chain once flush toilets arrived? Almost overnight, the entire poop economy collapsed. With the rise of enclosed sewage systems in the 19th century, human waste was no longer accessible. It vanished into pipes, into rivers, into distant treatment plants. The night soil man became an anachronism. His children found other trades. Fields were fed with chemical fertilizers. The sounds of buckets clinking at midnight gave way to the whoosh of progress. Even the once valued urine became useless. Synthetic ammonia replaced it in leatherwork. The fulling tubs fell silent. We began treating our waste not as a resource, but as a threat, an enemy to be buried, sanitized, and forgotten. Governments passed laws to make sure it never touched our hands, our eyes, our minds that we literally flushed. The economy down the toilet. And yet, in recent years, there's been an odd little revival, a return to waste-to-value thinking. Composting toilets, biogas projects, eco-villages powered by, you guessed it, poop. In Sweden, some urban buses now run on methane harvested from human waste. In India, entire homes are lit by toilet-powered generators. Some scientists even suggest future Mars colonies might survive off recycled human waste, extracting water, nutrients, and even fuel from what their bowels produce, which raises a curious, cosmic thought. We spent thousands of years turning poop into power, only to realize we might need to again. Maybe the people of the past weren't backward at all. Maybe their chamber pots, cesspits, and dung carts weren't relics of a dirty world, but blueprints for a future where nothing is wasted. And, as our ancestors knew all too well, poop happens, but what you do with it, that's economics. There was something paradoxical about the medieval and early modern world's relationship with human waste. On one hand, it was an everyday reality, a cycle of life and labor. On the other, it was loaded with shame, status, and symbolism. Take The social rank of the waste workers in Edo, Japan, night soilmen, called funaya, were seen as both essential and untouchable. They lived on the margins of society, often in designated neighborhoods, akin to the burocumen, Japan's hereditary outcasts. They touched what no one wanted to acknowledge, even as everyone depended on them. They were paid well, but never invited to dinner. The same was true in many Islamic cities. While Islamic hygiene laws were strict and comprehensive, emphasizing ritual cleanliness, hand-washing, and disposal of impurities, those who dealt with waste often belonged to the lowest caste-like professions. Ironically, the people who made cleanliness possible were considered unclean themselves. Even in medieval Christian Europe, waste collectors and cleaners were legally segregated. In Paris, the vidangeurs were prohibited from wearing fine clothes or carrying weapons. In London, some were required to ring bells or shout aloud when entering neighborhoods, so residents could avoid crossing their path. The city needed them, but didn't want to see them. Meanwhile, toilet servants in royal courts faced a very different fate. The infamous groom of the stool, as we mentioned in Part 6, wasn't just a stool wiper. He was a trusted advisor, a keeper of secrets, and a kind of personal butler to the monarch's most vulnerable moments. His role gave him unmatched access to the king, and over time, this humble-sounding position became a highly sought-after political appointment. By the time of Henry VIII, the groom was part treasurer, part confidant, part manager of court paperwork. From lowest to highest, the handling of waste was complicated. And then there were the urban legends of poop alchemy. Yes, you heard that right. Some Renaissance natural philosophers believed that human waste could be transmuted into gold. Others thought it might contain life essence that could be distilled into medicine, because if the body expelled it, perhaps it carried trace evidence of disease or imbalance. One bizarre recipe from a 16th century German alchemical manual involved mixing dried feces with crushed pearls and wine to create an elixir of vitality. The results were likely explosive, but we can only assume the alchemist had a very strong stomach and a very open-minded patron. Meanwhile, urine was collected for homemade gunpowder in fact, saltpeter, a critical ingredient in black powder, was extracted from urine-soaked straw or soil, especially in regions where bat guano wasn't readily available. Villagers in England and France would dig niter beds, literally fields for peeing into, so the salts could be harvested months later. The government sometimes commandeered village urine during wartime. Talk about weaponizing bodily fluids. In some parts of Scandinavia, women would store menstrual rags and urine cloths in sealed clay pots and sell them to folkloric healers who believed these items could be used in protective magic or fertility rites. These weren't just superstitions. They were small-scale, community-driven economies based on bodily waste as talisman. And perhaps the most poetic example of all, the piss prophets of the Middle Ages and early modern era. These were men, and sometimes women, who claimed they could diagnose illness by inspecting urine. They would collect samples in flasks, hold them up to the light, swirl them gently, and observe the bubbles. A healthy person's urine, they claimed, should shimmer like amber, a sick person's like a muddy stream. Their services were paid, for in coin or kind. And yes, they had charts. In some places, they were ridiculed. In others, they were trusted more than physicians. All this tells us one thing. Waste, in the past, was never just waste. It was a mirror reflecting everything, from your diet to your dignity. It was a currency, a commodity, a chemical, a political tool, a status symbol, and sometimes a superstition. Where we today see a flush handle and move on, People in the past saw a whole world of meaning. They smelled opportunity, they saw resource, and they acted on it. With scoops, sacks, potions, and piety, the old saying didn't go, but probably should have. Where there's muck, there's money. If you've been following this strange, stinky journey through history, you may think that humans have always been fairly practical when it came to their biological necessities. Use, flush, forget. Or in the case of medieval folk, squat, scoop, and hope no one sees. But in the later centuries of the Middle Ages and into the early modern era, a new kind of fear began to creep in. Not of what waste was, but of what it meant. Of what it might be doing invisibly, silently, and lethally. You see, before people understood germs, they feared smell. Welcome to the age of miasma theory, where people thought disease came not from bacteria, but from bad air. The kind of air that hovered above stagnant ponds, seeped out of latrines, and snuck in from the privy under the floorboards. The kind of air that smelled like, well, exactly what you think. And if you think this fear was silly, consider this. It influenced the design of cities, the construction of houses, the clothes people wore, and even what doctors prescribed to prevent the plague. Let's step into the nasal nightmare of the privy panic. Long before Louis Pasteur waved his microscope and taught us about bacteria, most societies explain disease in one of two ways: divine punishment or bad air. And of the two, miasma was the more scientific. The word miasma comes from Greek, meaning pollution. Ancient writers like Hippocrates and Galen believed that foul odors, particularly from decaying matter, could corrupt the body's humors and cause illness. This idea clung on like a bad stench for centuries. By the 14th century, as the Black Death scythed through Europe, the miasma theory had become mainstream. People believed that the smell itself could kill. When your city street doubled as a sewer that wasn't just unsightly, it was deadly. When your chamber pot hadn't been emptied, it wasn't just disgusting, it was a biohazard, at least by medieval standards. And when your neighbor flung their night soil from the upper window and yelled, "Gardaloo," you didn't just duck, you held your breath and ran like hell. But the miasma panic didn't just affect the poor. Oh no, it thrived among the elite, wealthy homes. People began installing smell traps and elaborate ventilation systems, decades or even centuries before they had proper plumbing. Chamber pots were kept in closets behind closets. Curtains were soaked in vinegar, rosewater, or camphor to purify the air. Even bed linens were scented to mask the invisible doom lingering in the privy. Doctors recommended carrying pomanders, little metal balls filled with herbs and resins, to sniff as you walked past areas of suspicion. Upper-class people stuffed their handkerchiefs with lavender and cloves, held tightly to their noses in the streets. The privileged even designed their outfits to protect them from bad air. Enter the plague Dr. Mask. That long, sinister beak wasn't just for theatrical effect. It was packed with aromatic herbs, designed to filter the air so the doctor wouldn't inhale the deadly miasma. The theory went, if you couldn't smell it, you wouldn't catch it. It didn't work. But it made them look like terrifying birds of death, which, frankly, feels like an appropriate metaphor for how most people treated public health at the time. Meanwhile, cities began passing laws, not necessarily to clean up the filth, but to hide or cover it. In 16th century Paris, you could be fined for allowing the stench of your privy to reach the street. Not for having waste, mind you, but for letting others smell it. London's magistrates banned butchers from dumping offal in public gutters unless it was done at night. Out of sight, out of smell, out of mind. This birthed a kind of invisible war on stench. Architects began designing homes with smell channels and air chimneys. People paid perfumers not just to scent their bodies, but their homes, their privy corners, even their servant quarters. Where there's wealth, there's fragrance. And yet, the fear remained. But here's where the story turns slightly mad as the Industrial Revolution dawned in the 18th century. Cities grew denser. Waste piled up faster. Streets became rivers of rot. And the miasma theory entered its apocalyptic phase in the 1850s. London suffered what's now called the Great Stink. The River Thames, effectively the city's sewer, had become so foul in summer heat that Parliament was forced to adjourn. Lawmakers hung soaked curtains across windows and doused themselves in cologne. One MP proposed building a massive curtain of lime-soaked sheets across the river to block the stench. Citizens demanded action, not because they knew about germs, but because the smell was unbearable. This led to the construction of London's massive sewer system, designed by Joseph Bazalgette. It wasn't built because people knew how disease worked. It was built because the air smelled so bad it was politically untenable. A feat of engineering born from nasal distress. The irony? In doing so, they accidentally defeated cholera, a disease that had been ravaging the city for decades, because it was waterborne, not airborne. The miasma theorists were wrong, but they stumbled onto a solution anyway. Call it the most productive panic in history. Of course, not everyone responded to the panic with public works. Some responded with superstition and ritual. In parts of Germany, housewives would burn bundles of thyme and sage near the chamber pot to purify the air. In rural France, some households hung animal bladders filled with aromatic oils from the ceiling, believing they would absorb bad vapors. Others placed onions by the door, sliced open, to trap the miasma, which probably just made the place smell like poo and onions. Even funeral customs were influenced. In some Italian towns, corpses were buried with flowers not for sentiment, but to mask the death stink long enough to ward off infection. Cemeteries were built on hillsides or outside town walls, in part to keep their smell and thus their sickness far from the living. And in monasteries, where cleanliness was next to godliness, monks would waft incense into latrines during certain holy days. Some abbeys even had fragrant privy gardens, lavender and rosemary growing near the toilet towers, to maintain holy olfactory balance. But the fear didn't just stay outside in people's minds. The line between dirt and sin began to blur. The Protestant Reformation emphasized inner purity. The Catholic Counter-Reformation responded with ceremonies of cleansing. Everyone was sniffing for moral rot, and bodily waste, always taboo, became an even more potent symbol of moral corruption. Children were taught not only that filth makes you sick, but that it meant you were weak, lazy, or spiritually compromised. In polite society, even mentioning the privy became an art of euphemism. I must powder my nose. I'm stepping out for a moment. I need to see. A man about a horse. Anything but the truth. The toilet, once a necessary evil, became a psychological landmine. It was feared, hidden, perfumed, and repressed, and the fear lasted far longer than you'd think. Even into the 20th century, homes were still being built without indoor toilets, not because of cost, but because of lingering fear. What if the stink got inside? What if the pipe cracked? What if you breathed something foul? It would take science, not just smell, to banish those fears for good. So, what do we make of it all? There was a time when people built architectural wonders, not because they understood bacteria, but because their noses couldn't take it anymore. There was a time when a scent could sentence a neighborhood, or save a king. A time when air itself was the villain in every toilet. A portal to death. The rise of the privy panic wasn't just about toilets. It was about how fear shapes our world, even when we don't understand what we're afraid of. And next time you light a candle in the bathroom, just remember you're keeping a 1,000-year-old tradition alive. But let's not give too much credit to the elites and their lavender-scented paranoia. While nobles clutched pomanders and debated scented wallpaper, the common folk had their own strategies for battling the invisible doom that in the crowded tenements of 17th century cities, where multiple families might share one overflowing privy. In a courtyard, the solution wasn't to eliminate waste. It was to outsmell it. Enter the age of the stink wars. Imagine living in a building where your neighbors burned pungent herbs, tossed orange peels on a hot coals, or sprinkled vinegar on the floorboards, not to clean, but to fight smell with smell. Some families hung dried citrus peels by the door, while others, in a budget-conscious move, simply urinated in different corners, hoping it would cancel out older smells. Even clothing became a battlefield. Perfumed gloves, scented hats, even shoes stuffed with dried mint were all in fashion, not for seduction, but for self-defense. Unless we think this was a strictly urban obsession, the countryside had its own version of the stink spiral. Rural folk, lacking privies, might relieve themselves behind the barn or in the pig pen, but many still feared the consequences of lingering vapors. So they planted latrine hedges, rows of aromatic herbs like sage, rosemary, and tansy, around their designated dumping spots. These weren't just to hide the view. They were to cleanse the soul through the nose. Meanwhile, governments, increasingly pressured by stink-stricken citizens, began commissioning public air quality reports. In Venice, inspectors walked the canals with scented handkerchiefs, attempting to locate the bad winds and recommend remedies. In Prague, authorities ordered the burning of aromatic woods like juniper and pine on street corners during summer, particularly near public privies and fish markets. A double whammy of miasma, by the 18th century, the miasma theory had begun to infiltrate not just architecture, but urban policy. City planning evolved around airflow. Houses were designed with higher ceilings. Privies were relocated to the farthest possible corner of the backyard, or even onto outdoor bridges hanging over rivers, where the wind might carry the smell away. Hospitals and poorhouses were retrofitted with wide-open courtyards, not for aesthetics, but for air cleansing. And during epidemics, entire neighborhoods were ordered to burn herbs en masse. A medieval version of fumigation. Did it work? Absolutely not. But at least the streets smelled slightly more festive while people continued to die of cholera. Still, the battle against privy panic had some accidental successes. In 1740s France, a physician named Jean-Noël Halley began taking water samples from wells near cesspits. He noticed a disturbing pattern. Where the smell was worst, the sickness was most common. Though still operating under miasma theory, his research would later influence early public sanitation policies. Likewise, in Germany, the city of Hamburg introduced vented latrine towers, multi-story outhouses with wooden shafts extending above roof level to let the vapors rise. While designed for smell control, they inadvertently encouraged early forms of vertical ventilation, a stepping stone to modern building codes. And in England, even as doctors sniffed roses to fend off death, the privy builders, the unsung engineers of the underworld, were experimenting with new materials. Bricks that sealed in odors, angled chutes that flushed with gravity, even charcoal-lined pits to absorb stink. None of these were perfect. Most were still guesswork. But all of them paved the way, quite literally, for the sanitary revolutions of the 19th century. The real irony, of course, is that the miasma theorists weren't entirely wrong. Smell didn't cause disease, but it often indicated its presence. Where Waste festered, so did germs. Where air was foul, water was likely contaminated. Their noses weren't lying. They just didn't yet have the microscopes to see what was riding along on the breeze. And so they built and burned and perfumed. Not because they knew the science, but because they knew the fear. The fear of stink wasn't just physical. It became moral, social, and even existential. To smell bad was to be unclean. To live near a privy was to be poor. To be unable to escape. The odor was to be cursed. And the very design of homes, streets, and cities still carries the phantom memory of that panic. Today, we flush and forget. But we still light a candle. We still crack a window. Some even spray a floral mist before guests arrive, just in case, because somewhere deep in the folds of our social memory, the stink still lingers. We've squatted over holes, dumped from castle towers, hurled chamber pots onto unsuspecting passers-by, and prayed that rosemary would protect us from invisible stink demons. But finally, humanity asked a revolutionary question. What if the poop just disappeared? And with that daring dream, we stumble into the pre-modern toilet revolution, a time when porcelain met plumbing and excrement began its long, glorious journey down and away. Our story begins, strangely enough, in the court of Queen Elizabeth I. That among her suitors and schemers stood a man named Sir John Harington, a poet, translator, and, most importantly, a nobleman with a constipated imagination, fed up with chamber pots and foul smells. Harington built what may be the first modern flushing toilet in England. He called it the Ajax, a play on Ajax, slang for toilet, and it featured a water cistern, a valve, and a seat so refined it could make a queen blush. In fact, he installed one for Queen Elizabeth herself, though legend says she found it too noisy. Imagine that. The Renaissance had arrived, and the throne was too flushy. But while Harrington's invention was brilliant, it was also ahead of its time. With no sewage infrastructure to handle it, his flushing privy was like giving a Ferrari to a peasant farmer. Stylish, but useless in the mud. Fast forward to the 19th century, where the true heroes of the toilet emerged, not kings or poets, but engineers, plumbers, and sanitation freaks. Point one name you've probably heard, usually in a giggle, is Thomas Crappard, and no, he didn't invent the toilet. But yes, he was absolutely obsessed with it. Crappard was a plumber by trade and a marketing genius by nature. He patented improvements to flushing mechanisms, opened London's first bathroom showroom, complete with working toilets on display, and sold so many fittings to royalty that his name became synonymous with the act itself. He made toilets posh, elegant, desirable. He gave us valves, ball cocks, siphons, and more importantly, the illusion that waste could vanish cleanly and quietly forever. And so, in Victorian homes, the thunderbox gave way to the porcelain throne. A miracle of ceramic, copper, and denial. But the porcelain dream would have gone nowhere without a revolution beneath our feet. You see, while Crappard decorated toilets like opera stages, others were busy digging tunnels. The Great Stink of 1858, when the River Thames turned into a giant, boiling stew of human excrement, finally convinced the British government to fund a real sewer system. Enter Joseph Bazalgette, a civil engineer with a spine of steel and a nose of leather. He built over 1,100 miles of sewers under London, channeling waste away from the city and into treatment areas downstream. His work literally changed the smell of an empire. And similar efforts soon followed in Paris, Hamburg, New York, and Tokyo. For the first time in history, waste disposal became a municipal priority, and cities began to flush in unison. Meanwhile, the rise of indoor plumbing turned toileting into a private ritual. Where once we'd squatted in open trenches beside strangers, now we shut the door and locked the world out. Toilets moved indoors. Bathrooms got tiled. Water tanks were hidden in the wall, and the act of relieving oneself transformed from a public survival task into a moment of quiet solitude. Some called it progress. Others missed the view from the garderobe that by the early 20th century, the toilet had become not just a fixture, but a symbol of cleanliness, of class, of civilization. A clean toilet meant you had water, plumbing, privacy, and maybe even dignity. Advertising caught on. Magazines touted luxury water closets. Hotels advertised hygienic modern facilities. The White House added a bathroom with gold-plated flush handles. And in time, entire global sanitation campaigns took shape, from urban sewers in London to latrines in rural India. Toilets became tools of development, of education, of human rights. The humble act of sitting and flushing became, ironically, a source of national pride. And yet, have we really changed? Sure. We have apps that control our bidets. Our toilet seats warm themselves. Some even play music. But most of the world still lacks basic sanitation. And the stigma around waste, the giggles, the shame, the perfume sprays, still clings to us like a Victorian lace doily that we may have conquered the stink, but we're still uncomfortable with the act. In a way, we're still medieval, we just carry our chamber pots in porcelain disguise. The toilet may have evolved, but our relationship with it, still awkward, still secret, still deeply, hilariously, human. So next time you sit upon your gleaming ceramic throne, remember this. You are not just relieving yourself. You are participating in the most ancient, absurd, and oddly poetic ritual known to mankind. Congratulations that you're part of the legacy. And if you hear a flush echoing through history, it's just Sir John Harrington clapping politely from his Ajax. But while the West was polishing its porcelain, other corners of the globe were charting very different paths to cleanliness. In Japan, for example, the approach to hygiene was always more ritualized, more integrated with daily life. Long before electric bidets and automatic lids, the Japanese were washing rather than wiping, cleansing both body and soul in a culture that revered purification. The modern washlet wasn't just an appliance. It was the logical endpoint of centuries of ritualized ablution. Meanwhile, in India, where the flush toilet never fully conquered the cultural terrain, traditional squat latrines still dominate. Not because of backwardness, but because of biology and biomechanics. Squatting, as modern science now sheepishly confirms, is actually healthier for digestion and elimination than the Western sit-down style. Yes, dear viewers, the ancestors were right. Again, ironically, as urban India began to embrace ceramic thrones, Silicon Valley health gurus started buying squat stools to recreate the posture of a medieval peasant. There's a strange poetic justice in that. Yet, as toilets went global, so did inequality. In developed cities, flushing became so ordinary that people stopped thinking about where things went. The toilet became a magical portal. Press the button and poof. All evidence of humanity erased. But in much of the world, toilets remain luxuries. Today, over 3.5 billion people still lack access to safely managed sanitation. Open defecation remains common in dozens of countries. In some slums, families share a single latrine among hundreds. In others, women wait until nightfall to relieve themselves in dangerous fields, risking assault for the sake of privacy. We built sewers under Paris, but forgot to build dignity for everyone. Modern organizations like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and the World Toilet Organization are now fighting to bring safe, affordable sanitation to the global poor, not just for health, but for gender equality, education, and human rights. Turns out, you can't talk about progress without talking about poop. And what about the future? Well, brace yourself. Because the toilet of tomorrow might be watching you. Smart toilets are now fitted with sensors, Wi-Fi, and diagnostic AI. Some can scan your urine for signs of cancer, analyze your gut bacteria, or send poop reports directly to your doctor, which means one day soon, your toilet might know you better than your therapist. In a post-pandemic world, hygiene has become sexy again. Toilets flush hands-free. Seats sanitize themselves. Public restrooms look like spaceship pods. And privacy? That's optional, some. Japanese bathrooms now play artificial flushing sounds to mask the real flushing. Because the future isn't just clean. It's acoustically considerate. But here's the final irony. For all our engineering marvels and golden handles, for all our IoT-enabled bidets and water-saving jets, the real achievement wasn't just flushing waste. It was transforming something inherently human into something universally accepted. The toilet is civilization's silent cornerstone. A humble ceramic confession booth where emperors, monks, milkmaids, and software engineers all return, daily, urgently, unglamorously, to the same mortal ritual. Every time you flush, you're not escaping history, that you're joining it, and no matter how futuristic your bathroom becomes, whether it lights up like Tokyo or smells like cedar from the Alps, some part of you will always be that ancient Greek squatting in the gymnasium, that Roman on a sponge, that medieval peasant in a field of tansy in time. Because no matter how we evolve, nature still calls, and we, eternally, absurdly, still answer. And now, dear viewer, we've arrived at the end of a long, winding pipe of history, from Neolithic holes in the earth to the Wi-Fi-enabled smart toilets of Tokyo. This story hasn't just been about sanitation. It's been about civilization itself. Because every flush, every sponge on a stick, every chamber pot, launched from a window, tells us something deep and eternal about humanity, that we are a species that eats. A species that processes. A species that, well, must expel. And in that unglamorous act, repeated every day by kings and beggars alike, we glimpse a humbling kind of equality. Toilets, in all their forms, are more than convenience. They are cultural. Mirrors, they reveal what we fear, what we value, and how much we're willing to talk about the stuff we'd rather not mention. In ancient Rome, public toilets were gathering places, forums for the sphincter. In the Middle Ages, they were weapons of defense and disease. In Victorian homes, they were status symbols. And now, in the modern world, they're both technological wonders and symbols of global disparity. Some people flush with recycled rainwater. Others still squat over ditches. It's sobering. It's absurd. It's completely, beautifully human. The next time you sit in the quiet sanctuary of your bathroom, remember, you're not escaping the world, that you're participating in a legacy. A bizarre, 5,000-year-old tradition of grappling with the most universal of human experiences. And in that moment, eyes glazed, phone in hand, porcelain beneath you, you become part of something much larger than yourself. You join the long line of humans who, for millennia, have asked a single question: where am I supposed to go? But let's not pretend the modern toilet came with no side effects. We cemented the porcelain throne into every home. Something else quietly shifted: our relationship with waste. Out of sight, out of mind. No longer did we carry it, bury it, or toss it yelling "Gardaloo" into the streets. The flush disconnected us from our own biology. In medieval towns, you knew what your body produced. You saw it, smelled it, lived among it. Today, we flush it into a vast sewer system designed specifically so we never have to think about it again. Is that progress? Or a new kind of ignorance? Let's talk about design. Because the rise of modern bathrooms reshaped more than just waste removal. It changed our homes, our daily habits, even our privacy norms. In Victorian England, bathrooms were at first detached, literally, outhouses. Then came the indoor lavatory, often hidden away like a shameful secret. By the mid-20th century, the bathroom was no longer just functional. It was a place of retreat, a domestic sanctum where a stressed office worker could take a long bath and pretend they were Roman nobility, minus the slaves and scented oils. Luxury bathroom design exploded in the 1980s and 90s. Jacuzzi tubs, his and hers. Sinks, golden faucets, heated floors. You weren't just relieving yourself. You were performing a daily rite of bourgeois self-care. Toilets weren't utility anymore. They were aspiration. Meanwhile, in poorer neighborhoods, urban or rural, this evolution wasn't universal. Many homes in parts of the U.S., let alone the global South, still relied on pit latrines, shared restrooms, or even no toilet at all. The bathroom became a symbol of class division. When we talk about affordable housing, we often forget the most vital part: sanitation. A home without a toilet is not a home. It's a health risk. And in prisons, refugee camps, slums, sanitation often remains a weapon of control or a measure of neglect. In some places, withholding toilet access is a form of punishment. In others, it's just the status quo. Even as we invent AI-powered bidets, 800 million people still practice open defecation. That's nearly 1 in 10 humans. Now consider this. Toilets, for all their benefits, have created ecological burdens. Each flush uses, on average, 6 liters of clean drinking water. Multiply that by billions of flushes per day, and we begin to see the toilet is not just a marvel. It's a paradox that we engineered a miracle of cleanliness that quietly wastes our most precious resource. Eco-toilets, composting toilets, and waterless urinals have tried to step in. But public appetite remains low. Why? Because for most people, the flush is sacred. It symbolizes modernity, hygiene, and dignity. To question it feels regressive. So here we are, perched on porcelain, flushing away gallons, building sanitation empires, while pretending it's all just normal. And yet, the toilet's evolution isn't done. Not even close. The future? Think beyond smart. Think sustainable. Think surveillance. Imagine a toilet that tracks your microbiome, flags prediabetes, warns of nutrient deficiency, and syncs to your phone. Your daily dump could soon generate medical data. Governments may one day offer tax deductions for poop. Scans. Insurance premiums could fluctuate based on your fiber intake. Health reports may be, quite literally, crapped out each morning. And if that sounds far-fetched, remember, not long ago, people laughed at the idea of indoor plumbing. Or Wi-Fi. Or Bluetooth, but warmers. So, as we stand at the edge of this brave new bowl, maybe we should pause, not just to marvel at engineering, but to ask, what do toilets say about us? They say, we are clever. We are squeamish. We are determined to separate ourselves from the mess of life, while being forever tethered to it. Because behind every flush, there's a story. Of invention, inequality, adaptation, and aspiration. And that, dear viewers, is the history of civilization from the bottom up. Let's be honest, toilets are funny. They are the great equalizer, the humbler of egos, the punchline of every childhood joke. But after walking through thousands of years of human ingenuity and indignity, you start to realize they're also kind of sacred. Because what started as a hole in the dirt has become a symbol of everything we've tried to achieve as a species: cleanliness, dignity, privacy, order, and mastery over nature. And yet, for all the porcelain, all the pipes, all the perfumed hand soaps and automatic flushes, one question remains. Have we really come that far? Yes, we've built toilets that flush in multiple directions, that warm your seat and analyze your diet. Yes, we've eliminated the stench of cesspits, the splash of chamber pots, and the danger of being pooped on from a third-story window. But we've also flushed away our sense of awareness that we rarely ask. Where does it go? Who cleans it? What does it cost the planet? We live in a world where millions still go without basic sanitation. While others have gold-plated bidets that play Mozart, we've turned poop into taboo, that we've turned toilets into invisible gods. And we've forgotten that, at the end of the day, every empire still ends in a latrine. So, what have we learned? That waste isn't just something we produce, that it's something we build systems around, that it's something we hide, design for, legislate, tax, fear, and, in rare cases, celebrate. That it's political. It's architectural. It's theological. That it's human. So the next time you lock the bathroom door and sit down to do your business, know this: you are participating in a ritual older than writing, older than kings, older than almost every human institution. And it's not gross. It's not shameful. That it's the most democratic thing you'll do all day. This has been Veil of Epochs, pulling back the curtain on the strange, smelly, and surprisingly profound history of the toilet. And next time, we're flushing in a new direction. Prepare to explore the bizarre world of why people used to think bathing was dangerous to your soul. Because if you thought toilets were weird, wait till you find out why cleanliness was once considered a sin. Until then, stay curious, stay hygienic, and always remember, history isn't just what we build, it's what we leave behind.